What really prompted this talk was kind of a response to an emerging narrative that I've noticed, and I'm always kind of very much interested in this space of the narratives that are woven around China and its role in the Middle East. But a particular narrative is the emergence of the People's Republic as a credible mediator in the context of the Palestine-Israel conflict, which is sometimes rendered into China coming in as a savior or a backer of the Palestinians in confrontation with the US, which is a conventional, traditional backer of Israel. And of course, what has really kind of drummed up this narrative once more are really the events over the past year, starting with the war in Gaza, where, for instance, after the 7th of October attacks by roughly a month, Saudi Arabia organized an exceptional summit in Riyadh where it gathered the heads of states and foreign ministers of Muslim and Arab countries with the idea of kind of drumming up global support for reviving the two-state solution, but also primarily achieving a ceasefire in Gaza. And they organized a delegation of the foreign ministers of several Arab and Muslim states. The first country that they went to was China. And that kind of, underscored Beijing's perception as a primary great power that can really wade into this conflict. Another major event that happened a bit earlier this year, particularly in July 2024, was a meeting that was hosted by Beijing, bringing in the different Palestinian factions together. And the idea being here is that China was trying to reconcile their differences of view to bring about a unity government that would then kind of jumpstart the peace process once more. And there's a lot of literature that had been written around these two events and what they mean, but primarily they really come down to the notion of China emerging as a credible mediator and potentially even a savior in this context. And I think this narrative in many ways draws on two particular sources or founts. And we're going to unpack them in a moment. But the first one is essentially that China is perceived, particularly from the late 1990s, as emerging as a great power of significant influence within the Middle East, right? So wherever you look at, its footprint is quite visible. Economically, China is the primary customer of most of the hydrocarbon exporting countries. Some of them actually, their dependency on the Chinese market as an export destination is significant. A country like Oman actually, give or take on the data from the last 2 years, 75 to 85% of all of its hydrocarbon exports go to the Chinese market alone. China is the #1 trading partner for almost all of the Gulf states, as well as the other Arab states, Iran and Israel. So in many ways, its footprint is quite significant. Politically, it designates its relationships with many of these states as strategic partners, 战略伙伴, right, in the kind of the lingo of the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The Belt and Road Initiative covers all of the states there with the exception of Israel. So wherever you look, there is a very strong and pronounced Chinese presence, right? Even China's first overseas military base emerges in the periphery of the Middle East in Djibouti, right? And that also kind of led to a lot of speculation about what this means. Now, this expanding footprint in its own right is tied oftentimes with the narrative of great power competition. So if you look at a lot of the academic literature, the media coverage, and even kind of the debates at official policymaking levels, especially in Washington, D.C., right? A whole discussion on China in the Middle East is intertwined with the idea of competition with the US, right? Just very recently, in fact, the Congressional Senate issued a report of over 80 pages dealing with China in the Middle East, right? I mean, they do this actually periodically, but it just tells you a lot about how this presence is really interpreted through a particular prism. And it's something that has gone stronger over the years. I mean, it's very interesting how the Trump administration, the first one, began a project where they would appoint officers at different embassies who were primarily dedicated to watching Chinese activities in many different parts of the world. The Middle East was actually a launching point for that program. So they appointed one in Abu Dhabi, one in Cairo, one in other places. This project has expanded significantly under the Biden administration, and it's not likely to go away anytime soon. So the point of this, and why I'm kind of highlighting that it's tied to this great power competition narrative, is that in many ways this renders or leads to an interpretation of China as mediator as being read against the US, right? That China's wading into becoming a mediator and kind of supporting diplomatic efforts is read ultimately as something where it's attempting to usurp the US, right? And this is kind of something that ties a lot of different elements across what I would call campus cartographies together. So people who are very keen on protecting US interests read it as a challenge. People who are anti-US read this as a confirmation that the world is heading in a multipolar direction. So you can see how this is kind of a prism that orients and leads to a particular reading of China's engagement with Palestine through that.